This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a sledgehammer to, well, one of the most foundational beliefs about intellectual history.
The idea that it all starts with the Greeks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea that Western philosophy begins with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle.
It's a history we were all taught, right? This grand narrative of the eternal return to the Greeks. But if you actually look closely at the sources, you realize that history is based on a massive historical edit.
So today we're going to unpack a radical but historically precise claim. Western philosophy did not begin with Greece. Our mission today is to show you that the history we all read is actually a post facto edited history. It was built around a core intellectual project that ran for over 1,000 years.
All the way from one key Christian theologian right up to, well, the architect of modern German idealism.
So here's the central tension we want to explore. If the Western intellectual tradition didn't start with the Greeks, what did it start with?
And maybe more importantly, why did we spend so much time manufacturing the story that it did?
Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We have to start by just setting the historical record straight. I think we all imagine the philosophers of the early Middle Ages had, Aristotle and Plato on their bookshelves.
That was absolutely not the case. You have to understand the intellectual vacuum that existed after Rome fell.
An actual vacuum.
The Latin West was profoundly ignorant of the Greek philosophical tradition. It wasn't just a matter of, neglect. It was a matter of total absence.
Meaning they couldn't even read it.
After the Roman Empire dissolved, the ability to read and systematically translate Greek, largely disappeared in the West.
So if they wanted to read Plato, they couldn't just find a copy. They physically didn't have the bulk of the material.
Exactly. Plato's dialogues, Socrates' whole method, it was only known in fragments, often through secondary or tertiary Latin sources.
So they knew of Socrates.
They knew of him, sure. He was remembered as a kind of heroic, moral sage, almost a proto-martyr. But his core philosophical teachings were completely unavailable.
And Aristotle.
Even more so. The large systematic works of Aristotle, the metaphysics, the Nicomachean ethics, his natural sciences, all of that was entirely absent from the intellectual world of Western Europe.
So if that entire philosophical toolbox was missing, what did people even spend their time thinking about?
Well, early medieval thinking wasn't organized as an independent field of philosophy at all. It was dominated entirely by Christian theology.
Everything was theology.
Everything. It was centered on interpreting Scripture and the legacy of the patristic fathers. The overwhelming intellectual force was the lineage of Augustine. Every major concept, ethics, values, daily life, law, it was all expressed in a fundamentally theological language.
But we often hear about Boethius, the tragic figure who wrote the Consolation of Philosophy while he was in prison. Wasn't he the bridge, the guy who saved all this knowledge?
Boethius was crucial, but we have to be really specific about what he saved. He did provide a critical service by translating some of Aristotle's logical works, like the categories. But he did not transfer systematic Greek thought. He essentially passed on the memory that philosophy existed, the memory that it could offer comfort. But the vast organized structure you need to discuss causation or function or purpose.
Without just saying because God willed it.
Exactly. That was still missing.
So the key takeaway here is that Western thought really began in a state that was, for all intents and purposes, ignorant of Greece. It started its own distinct project, and it used a theological language for everything.
And that leads us to the true prototype of Western thinking, Augustine of Hippo.
Okay, let's talk about this project arc that runs from Augustine all the way to Hegel. What structural mold did Augustine create without having all that Greek thought?
Augustine developed what we now recognize as the unique foundation of the Western self. He created the framework of interiority, Christian temporality, and historical consciousness.
Okay, stop there for a second. What do you mean by interiority in this context?
Greek philosophy, broadly speaking, was focused on understanding the external world, the cosmos, nature, the polis. Augustine. He shifted the focus inward.
The inner self.
The inner self. Conscience, guilt, the whole complex landscape of the human will. He argued that the path to truth wasn't outward, but in the internal journey of the soul. He basically created the model of the self we still operate under today.
And he tied that to time and history.
Yes. For Augustine, history was linear. It moved from creation to the fall toward a guaranteed historical completion salvation. This structure, internal starting point, movement through time, final resolution, That is the prototype.
But like you said, a structure needs tools, an operating system.
Precisely. And that's where this massive import of foreign material happens in the 12th century. The system finally gets the philosophical OS it lacked.
And that is Aristotle.
That is Aristotle.
Okay.
The sophisticated vocabulary needed to discuss mechanics, logic, physics, all of it, outside of purely theological terms, was supplied by his systematic reimportation. This was a seismic event.
And that knowledge didn't just reappear out of nowhere. It traveled a great distance.
A huge distance. Crucially, this came via the massive Latin translation movement, and often through Arabic sources. In places like Spain and Sicily,
Right.
thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes had preserved and, elaborated on Aristotle for centuries, while the Latin West knew nothing about him. When his works flooded the new universities, they provided the technical language, the self-standing vocabulary of causation and logic that allowed medieval scholars to analyze the world systematically.
So Aristotle becomes the intellectual operating system for the medieval university. I like that image. But where was Plato during this 12th century intellectual revolution?
And that's a key detail that gets overlooked. Plato's works were not systematically received at the same time. While Aristotle was dominating the universities, the full Platonic dialogues only started to be widely read and translated during the Renaissance.
3 centuries later.
3 centuries later. That is a huge gap in intellectual history.
It really is.
It was humanists like Marsilio Ficino, often using Byzantine sources after Constantinople fell in 1453, who were responsible for this massive influx of Platonic thought. So you could say Aristotle provided the technical, analytical tools for the medieval structure.
While Plato, arriving much later, provided a more spiritual, cultural, and aesthetic resource.
Exactly. Something that really fired the Renaissance imagination.
Okay, so we have the Augustinian structural prototype, the Aristotelian toolbox from the 12th century, and the Platonic cultural energy from the 15th. Where does this long-term project finally culminate?
It culminates with Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. If Augustine created the structural beginning, Hegel performed the final declaration.
The end point.
The end point. By the early 19th century, Hegel was able to synthesize everything, the Greek thought, modern science, the nation-state, the university, into a single closed system of self-consciousness and history. He basically declared that philosophy had successfully explained the entire world process.
Now we get to the most provocative claim in our deep dive. Hegel is the final version of Augustine. How can you possibly connect a 4th century North African theologian to a 19th century German idealist?
The connection is purely structural. Hegel simply took Augustine's structural pattern and, well, he translated it to secular terms.
Give me an example.
Okay. Augustine's focus on interiority becoming self-knowledge. That becomes Hegel's spirit moving toward self-consciousness.
Okay, I see that.
Augustine's salvation history moving toward God's inner kingdom. That's Hegel's world history moving toward the absolute spirit. The pattern of starting internally, moving linearly through time, and achieving a guaranteed completion. It's identical.
So once Hegel finished that translation, the long Western project that began in the vacuum of Rome's collapse was declared finished.
It was declared complete.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because to complete the project, he had to do some historical editing. You highlight Hegel's famous, deeply satisfying statement that when we reach Greece and his history of philosophy, we feel as though we have returned home.
That statement is absolutely critical because it's not history, it's rhetoric.
It's self-serving editing.
It's self-serving editing. It was designed to justify his vast, closed system and the institution of Steve philosophy he helped establish. By claiming Greece was home, he was granting the Western structure a kind of timeless, universal legitimacy.
When the reality was that Greece was absolutely not home, it was a foreign system.
Exactly. The Greek spirit wasn't the West's natural ancestor, it was a dangerous tutor. When Aristotle's systematic thought arrived in the 12th century, it severely disrupted the stable, theological language of the medieval world. It forced them to think differently.
So Hegel's homecoming declaration, it was like a victory statement.
That's a perfect way to put it. It was a victory statement, proclaiming that the West had finally domesticated this powerful foreign input and forced it to serve the underlying Augustinian historical structure.
The project is closed, the tutor is domesticated, the system is complete. But closed systems are brittle.
Very brittle. And the Hegelian edifice, it collapsed quickly. The causes were surprisingly mundane and internal.
Not some big external attack.
No. Hegel's untimely death from cholera, political changes in Prussia that destabilized his position, a resurgence of rival theological movements, and of course the immediate split of his followers into the right and left Hegelian schools. The structure just crumbled from within.
This dramatically changes the role of the figure who came next. We always picture Nietzsche as this heroic destroyer, attacking the Hegelian castle with a hammer.
That's the popular myth, but our deep dive confirms that's not what happened. Nietzsche wasn't the destroyer. He was simply the first person standing in the ruins.
So he was the medical examiner.
He was the medical examiner, the witness who arrived on the scene the morning after the collapse. He didn't cause it. He just reported on it.
Which means his famous declaration, "God is dead," wasn't a revolutionary act of defiance.
No, it was a forensic report.
A forensic report. I love that.
It was. It confirmed that the great Hegelian synthesis, which had translated the theological God into this rational guarantee of spirit and history, had failed. Institutionally, intellectually, it was over. The ultimate anchor for meaning was gone.
So the post-Hegel crisis wasn't just a loss of faith in God. It was the loss of the rational guarantee, the idea that reason or history or the state could fundamentally explain and anchor the world.
And that immediately led to the central question for philosophy for the next 100 years. How do humans live when no final guarantee, God, reason, or history exists?
And this leads to a division of labor. Philosophers become specialists in managing the debris field.
That's a great way to put it. You had a whole cleanup crew.
Okay, let's map them out. Who did what?
You had the announcer of the collapse, which is Nietzsche, focused on the linguistic fallout. Then you had these retreat movements, Kierkegaard, who just radically rejected the whole system for subjective singular choice, or Husserl, who retreated into phenomenology, trying to guarantee meaning by focusing on consciousness itself.
And then you had the philosophers who confronted the consequences head-on.
Absolutely. The confrontation. Thinkers like Heidegger and Sartre, wrestling directly with existence and radical responsibility in a world without an anchor. You also had thinkers trying to reestablish social thought, Camus on absurdity, Hannah Arendt on political judgment.
And finally,
the deconstructionists like Foucault and Derrida, who basically spent their careers meticulously rejecting the very possibility of building another grand, totalizing narrative like Hegel's.
so the entire trajectory of modern Western philosophy is essentially the cleanup of the Augustine to Hegel project.
In many ways, yes.
This brings us to the 21st century map. The ultimate guarantees are gone. We have a triple vacuum: no God, no reason, and science, for all its power, can't provide moral justification or ultimate value.
That is the core modern problem. Science is incredible at explaining how things work, but it completely fails to explain why we should live or what is good.
So what's the realization?
The modern realization is that if the world is not one universal story guaranteed by reason, it is, as thinkers like Marcus Gabriel suggest, a collection of fields of meaning.
Multiple realities,
Yeah.
side by side. So if universal guarantees are out, the only practical solution has to be local judgment, the community approach.
Exactly.
Mhm.
It brings us back to this surprisingly simple ancient wisdom. When in Rome, do as the Romans do.
Right.
Conflict arises when we mistakenly apply the rules and assumptions of one field of meaning onto another. So we have to get really clear on distinguishing between these fields.
So let's define them. What's the difference between the local and the urban society in this context?
The local rural area is the field of thick meaning and value. It's defined by inherited customs, dialect, shared history, comprehensive moral expectations.
To fit in, you have to really fit in.
The condition for integration is high conformity, deep assimilation. You have to learn the unspoken rules. This is where identity is rooted. Trying to institute local internationalization here is just a nonsense phrase.
Whereas the urban environment has to function completely differently.
The city is the field of thin meaning. It operates on rules of functionality, contracts, traffic laws, efficiency, safety, and most critically, mutual non-aggression. The city works by sharing mechanisms designed to avoid conflict and allow coexistence before you even get to sharing deep values.
So trying to impose thick local ethics onto the functional city, it just leads to clashes.
Immediately. The wisdom required today is structural. We must not confuse the fields. Don't urbanize the local by stripping it of its thick meaning, and don't impose thick local rules on the diverse, thin meaning of the city.
And this structural understanding, you argue, leads to a kind of necessary land ethic.
It has to. Given that thick, sustainable local meaning requires a dense social fabric, The functional choice is to concentrate populations in viable centers, local hubs or functioning cities, and consciously return abandoned, unsustainable areas to nature.
So this isn't about defeat. It's an intelligent, functional shift. You're talking about closing the Lichtung, the clearing that Heidegger described as the space for human existence, and allowing that land to revert to a managed wild state.
Precisely. The Lichtung is the space we've cleared for our being, and we've over-cleared. This is about closing those untenable clearings and returning them to managed forest or rewilding. It's a move from endless expansion to intelligent compaction.
Wow. Okay, this has been a massive historical correction. We've gone from the intellectual vacuum of the Latin West through the Augustine to Hegel project, detailed the collapse of all philosophical guarantees, and finally landed on a 21st century map based on structural wisdom and managing distinct fields of meaning.
And the final conclusion is that the 21st century task is not to pursue progress towards some unified universal world system. It's to wisely manage these distinct, necessary fields of meaning. In a way, we're just taking very old communitarian wisdom and reapplying it as a conscious structural and ecological design.
We established today that Western philosophy's supposed homecoming to Greece was a powerful, deliberate act of historical editing, the construction of what you call the manufactured home of reason.
And if the ultimate guarantee of reason was built on a convenient and justified narrative, this raises an important question for you, the listener. What other foundational beliefs or cultural origins in your own life, the stories you use to justify your identity or your institutions, are similarly constructed narratives? What personal or cultural idea have you been told is home that was actually a necessary, powerful, and useful import you only domesticated much later?
Something to think about until our next deep dive.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.